You know what hurts the most? It's not the wrinkles that appeared seemingly overnight around my eyes, or the way my back aches when I get out of bed each morning in my small two-bedroom house in Hartford, Connecticut. It's not even the way my hands shake slightly when I pour my morning coffee from the same ceramic pot I've used for 30 years. No, what cuts deepest is the way my own family looks right through me now, as if I'm just another piece of furniture that's been around too long, familiar, functional, but ultimately forgettable. I'm Margaret Thompson, 72 years old, and for the past 50 years, I've been the invisible backbone of this family. I raised 3 children in a modest colonial house on Maple Street while working full-time as a high school English teacher at Hartford Public High School. For 4 decades, I stood in front of classrooms filled with teenagers who thought they knew everything, teaching them about Shakespeare, Steinbeck, and the power of words to change lives. I graded papers until midnight, attended every parent-teacher conference, and somehow managed to make my modest teacher's salary stretch to cover dance lessons, soccer cleats, and college application fees. I supported my husband Robert through 3 different career changes, from insurance sales to real estate to finally settling into accounting, never once complaining when his dreams meant tighter budgets and longer hours for me. When he had his first heart attack at 58, I became his caregiver while still teaching full-time. When he had his second at 62, I took early retirement to care for him properly. And when he passed away 5 years ago, I buried him with the dignity he deserved, even though it meant using most of our savings for a funeral that his children barely attended. My daughter Sarah graduated from medical school last month after 8 grueling years of study. After watching her struggle through organic chemistry, survive the MCAT, and push through the exhaustion of clinical rotations, she finally achieved her dream of becoming a doctor. I was prouder than I'd ever been of anything in my life, prouder than when I received my master's degree in education, prouder than when I was named Teacher of the Year, prouder even than when I published my small collection of poetry in the local literary magazine. When Sarah announced there would be a formal graduation dinner at the prestigious Riverside Country Club, I felt a flutter of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. I spent weeks planning what to wear, settling on my navy blue dress, the same one I'd worn to her high school graduation, carefully preserved and still elegant. I imagined how I'd congratulate her in front of all her accomplished friends and colleagues, how I'd finally meet the people she'd spent years studying alongside, how they'd see where her strength and determination came from. The Riverside Country Club sits majestically on the banks of the Connecticut River, its colonial architecture gleaming white against the backdrop of autumn maples that were just beginning to turn brilliant shades of gold and crimson. I remember driving past it as a young mother, pointing it out to my children from the window of our old station wagon, telling them that someday we'd celebrate something truly important there. That someday had finally arrived, but something felt different in the weeks leading up to the dinner. Sarah's voice on the phone had been distant when she mentioned the event, almost reluctant. "It's just a small gathering, Mom. Nothing too fancy. Just some colleagues and friends." But I could hear the excitement she was trying to contain, the pride she was attempting to downplay. This was her moment, her triumph, and I wouldn't miss it for the world. What I didn't know was that this evening would change everything between us, that the woman they all saw as just the old lady in the back was about to remind them exactly who Margaret Thompson really is, and why underestimating a woman who survived 7 decades of life's challenges is the biggest mistake they could ever make. The October evening was crisp and clear as I pulled my 10-year-old Honda Civic into the circular driveway of the Riverside Country Club. The valet, a young man probably around Sarah's age, took my keys with a genuinely polite smile and helped me out of the car with the kind of respect that made me remember why I'd always loved young people, despite their occasional thoughtlessness. I walked through the massive mahogany doors, my heels clicking against the marble foyer, feeling elegant in my carefully chosen navy dress and the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. The main dining room took my breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, casting warm, golden light over tables draped in pristine white linens. Fresh autumn flowers, deep burgundy chrysanthemums and golden marigolds adorned each table, and the tall windows offered a stunning view of the river, where the setting sun painted the water in shades of amber and rose. About 60 people mingled throughout the room, champagne glasses in hand, their conversations creating the sophisticated hum of successful professionals celebrating achievement. I recognized some faces from Sarah's medical school graduation ceremony. Her professors, a few classmates, some family members of other graduates. Everyone looked polished and accomplished, the men in dark suits and the women in elegant cocktail dresses that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. But I held my head high, knowing I belonged here just as much as anyone else. After all, I was the mother of the guest of honor. I began searching for my name among the place cards at the head table, where I naturally assumed I'd be seated near Sarah and her fiancé, David. The calligraphy was beautiful, each name written in flowing script on thick cream cardstock. I read them carefully. Dr. Sarah Thompson, David Mitchell, Esquire, Dr. Patricia Williams, Professor James Morrison, Dr. and Mrs. Robert Chen. But no Margaret Thompson anywhere to be found. Confused, I moved to the tables immediately surrounding the head table, thinking perhaps they'd seated immediate family nearby. I checked every card twice, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. Still, nothing. I expanded my search to the tables in the middle of the room, then toward the sides, my confusion growing into something that felt uncomfortably like panic. Finally, I found it. At a small round table tucked into the very back corner of the room, partially hidden behind a decorative pillar, topped with an enormous floral arrangement, sat a simple white place card with black ink. But instead of seeing my name written in the same elegant calligraphy as all the others, I stared at 4 words that hit me like a physical blow. Old lady in the back. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I might be misreading it. I picked up the card with trembling fingers, hoping I was wrong, hoping it was some kind of mistake. But there it was, clear as day. Not Margaret Thompson, not Sarah's mother, not even Mrs. Thompson or guest, just old lady in the back, as if I were some random elderly person who'd wandered in off the street rather than the woman who'd sacrificed everything to make this moment possible. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at those 4 devastating words while the celebration continued around me. I watched my daughter across the room, radiant in her success, wearing a beautiful black cocktail dress I'd never seen before, completely unaware of the humiliation burning in my chest like acid. She was laughing with her residency director, gesturing animatedly as she told some story, looking every inch the confident professional she'd become. I took my seat at the back table, alone except for an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Harold Whitman, someone's grandfather. The view from here was partially obstructed by the pillar, and the conversations from the head table were just distant murmurs. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 40 years projecting my voice to the back of classrooms, and now I was the one straining to hear from the back of the room. This was how my own daughter saw me now. Not as the woman who'd worked double shifts to pay for her MCAT prep courses. Not as the mother who'd driven 4 hours each way every month during her residency interviews. But as an inconvenience to be hidden away, an embarrassment to be managed rather than celebrated. But you know what they say about the view from the back of the room? Sometimes that's exactly where you need to be to see everything clearly. And what I was about to do would make sure everyone in this room remembered exactly who this old lady really is, and why you should never, ever underestimate a woman who spent her entire life fighting for respect. What would you do in my place? Would you stay silent and accept this treatment? Or would you find a way to remind them of your worth? Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see how this story unfolds. I sat in that back corner for the entire cocktail hour, nursing a single glass of white wine and watching my daughter work the room like the accomplished professional she'd become. She moved gracefully between groups of her medical school colleagues, her confidence evident in every gesture and smile. Her medical degree had given her instant credibility among these impressive people, doctors, lawyers, professors, and other professionals who represented the kind of success I'd always dreamed she'd achieve. But not once during that entire hour did she glance toward the back of the room. Not once did she introduce me to her colleagues or mention the woman who'd driven her to every study session during her undergraduate years, who'd stayed up until 3 a.m. helping her prepare for the MCAT, who'd taken out a second mortgage on the house to help pay for medical school when the scholarships and loans weren't enough. I might as well have been invisible, which, I was beginning to realize, was exactly how she wanted it. The elderly gentleman beside me, Harold, turned out to be far more interesting than his quiet demeanor initially suggested. As we talked, I learned he was a retired federal judge who'd graduated from Harvard Law School, served on the federal bench for 30 years, and was here celebrating his granddaughter's achievement. She was one of Sarah's classmates. He spoke with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who'd spent decades evaluating evidence and making difficult decisions. "And you?" he asked kindly, after sharing his own story. "What's your connection to our accomplished graduate?" "I'm Sarah's mother," I said simply, gesturing toward the head table where she was now laughing with her residency director, a distinguished woman in her 50s who commanded obvious respect from everyone around her. Harold's eyebrows rose slightly as he glanced at my place card, then back at me with an expression I recognized from my teaching days, the look of someone who'd just witnessed an injustice and was trying to process it. "I see," he said quietly, and I could tell he understood exactly what was happening here. "That's quite an accomplishment, raising a doctor. You must be very proud." "I am," I replied, though the words felt hollow given my current circumstances. "It's been a long journey." As dinner was served, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables and wild rice pilaf, accompanied by a crisp Sauvignon Blanc, I found myself thinking about all the times over the past few years that I'd been gradually pushed to the margins of my own family. When Sarah started seriously dating David 3 years ago, suddenly our weekly family dinners became young people's gatherings where I was politely but firmly excluded. When she got engaged last year, I was consulted about flowers and catering, the practical, unglamorous details, but excluded from the real planning, the fun decisions about venues and themes and guest lists. The pattern had become clear, though I'd been reluctant to acknowledge it. I was useful when they needed something, babysitting, cooking, financial help, but inconvenient when they wanted to present themselves as independent, sophisticated adults. I was the reminder of their humble beginnings, the evidence that they hadn't always moved in these elevated circles. But here's what Sarah didn't know about her mother. I hadn't spent 40 years teaching high school English without learning a thing or two about commanding a room and reading an audience. I hadn't raised 3 children through teenage rebellions, college applications, and early career struggles without developing some serious steel in my spine. And I certainly hadn't lived 72 years, buried a husband, survived cancer, and rebuilt my life from scratch without learning that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones you save for exactly the right moment. That moment was coming soon, and when it arrived, everyone in this room would understand exactly what kind of woman they'd underestimated. They were about to learn that Margaret Thompson didn't get to where she was by accepting disrespect quietly, and she certainly wasn't going to start now. The dinner plates were cleared away by efficient waitstaff, who moved through the room like a well-choreographed ballet, and the formal toasts began. David stood first, looking handsome and confident in his charcoal gray suit, his Harvard Law School ring catching the light as he raised his champagne glass. He spoke eloquently about Sarah's dedication and brilliance, about her compassion for patients and her bright future ahead as a surgeon. His words were polished and heartfelt, painting a picture of the woman he'd fallen in love with during their 3rd year of medical school. The room applauded warmly, and I found myself clapping along despite the growing knot in my stomach. Then Sarah's residency director, Dr. Patricia Williams, stood to speak. She was an imposing woman with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a burgundy silk dress that spoke of both authority and sophistication. She talked about Sarah's exceptional performance during her surgical rotations, her natural talent in the operating room, and her potential to become one of the finest surgeons of her generation. More enthusiastic applause filled the room, and I watched my daughter's face glow with pride and accomplishment. Finally, Sarah herself stood, looking radiant and confident as she thanked everyone for their support. She spoke about the challenges of medical school, the long nights of studying, the pressure of clinical rotations, and her excitement about starting her residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the most prestigious programs in the country. As she spoke, I found myself taking mental notes, the teacher in me automatically analyzing her presentation skills. Her voice was clear and strong, her posture confident, her eye contact excellent. I'd taught her well, I thought, with a mixture of pride and sadness. But as her speech continued, I noticed something that made my heart sink even further. She thanked David for his unwavering love and support through the difficult years. She thanked her professors and mentors for their guidance and wisdom. She thanked her medical school friends for their camaraderie and shared struggles. She thanked her residency director for believing in her potential. She even thanked the country club staff for providing such a beautiful venue for the celebration. But she never mentioned me. Not once. Not even in passing. Not even a generic thanks to my family that might have included me by implication. It was as if I simply didn't exist, as if her success had materialized out of thin air without any foundation, any sacrifice, any support from the woman who'd made it all possible. I watched from my corner table as she raised her champagne glass in a final toast to her bright future, and that's when I made my decision. I had spent months imagining this moment, planning what I would say when called upon to speak as the proud mother. I had a beautiful speech prepared about watching my daughter grow from a curious little girl who wanted to fix her broken dolls with band-aids and kisses into a woman who would heal real people with skill and compassion. But that speech was for a different evening, one where I was seated at the head table as an honored guest, not hidden away like a shameful secret. That speech was for a daughter who acknowledged her mother's role in her success, not one who pretended to be entirely self-made. Harold leaned over and whispered, "Are you going to say something?" I looked at him and smiled, not the polite, accommodating smile I'd worn all evening, but something sharper, more determined. "Oh yes," I said quietly, my voice carrying the authority I'd developed from decades of commanding respect in challenging situations. "I certainly am." I stood up slowly, deliberately, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor just loudly enough to catch the attention of the people at nearby tables. Then a few more heads turned, curious about the commotion in the back corner. The conversations began to quiet as people noticed the elderly woman rising to her feet, and I could feel the energy in the room shifting, focusing on me. Sarah looked confused, probably wondering why some random old lady was interrupting her celebration. Her expression showed mild annoyance mixed with concern. Was this some confused elderly guest who was about to embarrass everyone with an inappropriate story or rambling speech? But she was about to learn that this random old lady had quite a few things to say, and that underestimating Margaret Thompson was the biggest mistake she could have made. What would you do if your own child treated you like this at such an important moment? Would you speak up and demand the respect you deserve, or would you stay silent to avoid causing a scene? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to see what happens when this mother finally finds her voice. The room fell completely silent as I stood there in the back corner, all eyes now focused on me, with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The crystal chandeliers seemed to spotlight my position, and I could feel the weight of 60 pairs of eyes assessing this unexpected interruption to their elegant evening. I could see Sarah's face clearly now across the room. Confusion mixed with what looked like mild annoyance and growing embarrassment. She was probably thinking that some confused elderly guest was about to ramble about the good old days or share an inappropriate story that would mortify everyone present. I took a deep breath, drawing on 40 years of classroom experience, and began to speak. My voice carried the natural authority I'd developed from decades of commanding attention from rooms full of skeptical teenagers, projecting clearly to every corner of the dining room without seeming to strain or shout. "Good evening, everyone. I apologize for interrupting this lovely celebration, but I realized I haven't properly introduced myself to many of you." I paused deliberately, letting my words settle over the room like a stone dropped into still water. "My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm Sarah's mother." A visible ripple of surprise went through the crowd. I could see people glancing at my place card, then back at me, their expressions shifting as they began to understand the situation. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, and a few, particularly the older guests, seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. I've been sitting back here all evening, listening to these beautiful speeches about my daughter's accomplishments, and I've been thinking about something important. You see, 43 years ago, I was sitting in a very different kind of room. A delivery room at Hartford Hospital at 2:30 in the morning, holding a tiny baby girl who weighed exactly 6 pounds, 4 ounces, and who would grow up to save lives. Sarah's face had gone pale, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her champagne glass. She was beginning to realize where this was heading, and for the first time all evening, She was truly seeing me, not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as a force to be reckoned with. I spent the next 18 years driving that little girl to school every morning in our old station wagon, helping with homework every night at our kitchen table, working double shifts at the high school to pay for her college applications, SAT prep courses, and all the other expenses that come with nurturing a dream. I believed in her potential, even when she stopped believing in herself during organic chemistry, when she called me crying at midnight because she was sure she wasn't smart enough for medical school. The room was completely still now, the only sound the soft clink of crystal as someone nervously set down their glass. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, standing frozen with their serving trays as they listened to this unexpected turn in the evening's program. I took out a second mortgage on my house, the house where I still live, by the way, to help pay for medical school when the scholarships and loans weren't quite enough. I drove 4 hours each way every month to bring her home-cooked meals during her residency interviews because I knew she wasn't eating properly. I was there for every triumph and every setback, every celebration and every crisis, every moment of doubt and every breakthrough. I could see tears starting to form in Sarah's eyes, but I wasn't finished yet. I had 72 years of life experience, 40 years of teaching, and a lifetime of being underestimated to draw upon, and this room full of accomplished people was about to understand exactly what happens when you dismiss someone who's fought for respect every single day of her life. The moment I'd been building toward, not just tonight, but for years, was finally here, and everyone in this room was about to learn exactly what Margaret Thompson was made of. I could feel the power in my voice growing stronger with each word, decades of suppressed dignity finally finding its voice. The room remained absolutely silent, hanging on every syllable as I continued my speech that was transforming from an introduction into something much more profound. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to focus their light on me, creating an almost theatrical spotlight that made this moment feel both intimate and grand. But tonight, when I arrived at this beautiful celebration, a celebration that exists because of sacrifices I made willingly and lovingly, I discovered something quite interesting. I held up my place card, turning it so the entire room could see the cruel words written there. The cream cardstock trembled slightly in my fingers, not from nervousness, but from the sheer force of emotion I was channeling into this moment. This is how I was identified for this evening. Not as Margaret Thompson, not as Sarah's mother, not even as Mrs. Thompson, simply as old lady in the back. A collective gasp went through the room, the sound echoing off the coffered ceiling like a wave breaking against shore. I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God," and saw several people turn to stare at Sarah, whose face had gone from pale to completely white. Her champagne glass sat forgotten on the table, the bubbles long since gone flat, much like the celebration she had planned so carefully. David reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her eyes fixed on me with a mixture of horror and dawning realization. "Now, I want you all to understand something," I continued, my voice gaining strength and authority with each word. The teacher in me was fully awakened now, and I could feel the familiar rhythm of commanding a classroom, of holding an audience's complete attention through the sheer force of truth and conviction. I am indeed an old lady. At 72, I've earned every one of these wrinkles and gray hairs through years of laughter, tears, worry, and joy. But I am not just any old lady relegated to the back of the room like some forgotten piece of furniture. I began walking slowly toward the front of the room, my heels clicking authoritatively on the hardwood floor with a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. People instinctively moved aside, creating a path as I continued speaking, their faces showing a mixture of respect, embarrassment, and fascination. The autumn flowers on each table seemed to nod in approval as I passed, and I could smell the faint scent of the chrysanthemums mixing with the lingering aroma of the dinner we'd just finished. I am the old lady who worked 3 jobs to put herself through college in the 1970s when women weren't encouraged to pursue higher education, when guidance counselors told girls like me that we should focus on finding good husbands instead of good careers. I waitressed at a diner from 5 a.m. to noon, cleaned offices from 1 to 5 p.m., and studied until midnight every single day for 4 years. I am the old lady who became the first person in her family to earn not just a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree in English literature. The room was so quiet now that I could hear the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, marking time as I reclaimed my place in this story that had tried to erase me. Some guests were nodding in recognition of the struggle I was describing. Others looked uncomfortable as they realized their own privilege, and a few were openly emotional, perhaps thinking of their own mothers or grandmothers who had fought similar battles. I am the old lady who spent 40 years shaping young minds as an English teacher at Hartford Public High School, who was named Teacher of the Year 3 times, who helped hundreds of students discover their potential and find their voices when the world told them they didn't matter. I taught Shakespeare to kids who thought poetry was pointless and watched them discover that Hamlet's struggles weren't so different from their own. I helped teenage mothers finish their education, encouraged immigrant students to embrace their stories, and showed countless young people that their backgrounds were sources of strength, not shame. By now, I had reached the middle of the room, and every person there was completely focused on me. The energy had shifted entirely. I was no longer the forgotten old lady in the back, but the commanding presence at the center of everything. Harold, still seated at our back table, was smiling with obvious admiration, his judicial experience clearly recognizing the power of a well-delivered argument. I am the old lady who published poetry in literary magazines when editors told me that housewives didn't have anything important to say. I served on the school board for 10 years, fighting for better resources and smaller class sizes. I volunteered at the homeless shelter every Christmas for 2 decades, serving meals and listening to stories that would break your heart and rebuild your faith in humanity all at once. Sarah was now openly crying, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of her cruelty became clear not just to her, but to everyone in the room. Her colleagues, her professors, her friends, they were all witnessing the devastating truth about how she'd treated the woman who'd made her success possible. I could see some of them looking at her with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright disgust. I am the old lady who nursed her husband through 2 heart attacks while maintaining a full-time career, who learned to balance checkbooks and fix leaky faucets and change car tires because life doesn't wait for you to be ready. I am the old lady who became a widow at 67 and rebuilt her entire life from scratch, who learned that grief doesn't make you weak. It makes you understand what really matters. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with the weight of recognition and shame. Then, something extraordinary happened. Harold stood up from the back table and began to applaud, his weathered hands creating a sound that seemed to echo through the room like thunder. Slowly, one by one, other people joined him. Dr. Williams, Sarah's residency director, stood and began clapping with obvious respect and admiration. Then the other professors, recognizing the injustice they had witnessed, the medical school colleagues who understood the value of sacrifice and hard work. Within moments, the entire room was on their feet, giving me a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. The applause was thunderous, filled with genuine respect and admiration for a woman who had refused to be diminished. Everyone was standing and applauding, everyone except Sarah, who remained seated, sobbing into her hands, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had done to the woman who had given her everything. What would you do if you witnessed this moment? Would you stand and applaud for a mother's dignity? Or would you feel sorry for the daughter who had forgotten where she came from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to see how this powerful story concludes. The applause seemed to echo through the room for an eternity, reverberating off the walls and ceiling like a symphony of vindication. But eventually it faded, leaving behind a charged silence that felt completely different from the polite, superficial quiet that had dominated the evening before my speech. The very air in the room seemed to have changed, charged with new understanding and respect. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by 60 people who now saw me not as an inconvenience to be hidden away, but as a woman who had commanded their respect through sheer force of truth, dignity, and lived experience. As people slowly took their seats, I could see the ripple effects of my speech spreading through the room like stones thrown into still water. Conversations began in hushed, urgent tones as guests processed what they had just witnessed. The comfortable assumptions they had made about success, about worthiness, about who deserved recognition had been completely shattered in the span of 10 minutes. Some of Sarah's medical school colleagues were looking at her with expressions ranging from sympathy to outright disappointment, their respect for her clearly diminished by what they had learned about her treatment of me. Her professors seemed particularly affected by what had transpired. These were people who understood intimately the value of sacrifice and hard work, who had spent their careers recognizing and nurturing potential in others. They could see the injustice of what had happened here tonight, and more importantly, they could see the strength and intelligence that Sarah had inherited from me. Dr. Williams, in particular, looked deeply troubled, her sharp eyes moving between Sarah and me as if she were reassessing everything she thought she knew about her promising resident. Dr. Williams approached me as I made my way back toward my table, her burgundy silk dress rustling softly as she walked. The authority that had seemed so intimidating earlier now felt respectful, almost deferential. "Mrs. Thompson," she said quietly, her voice filled with genuine respect and what sounded like embarrassment, "I had no idea about your background, about the extent of your sacrifices. Sarah has never mentioned, we knew she was dedicated and hard-working, but we didn't realize the foundation that made that possible." She paused, glancing back at Sarah, who was still seated at the head table, no longer crying but staring down at her hands as if she could disappear into them. "I'm deeply sorry for how you were treated tonight. It's completely unacceptable, and frankly, it makes me question some things about character that I thought I understood." "Thank you for saying that," I replied simply, my voice still carrying some of the authority from my speech. "But this isn't really about apologies from strangers, though I appreciate your kindness. This is about my daughter learning to value the people who love her and understanding that success without gratitude is just another form of poverty." Other guests approached me as I walked back to my table, each interaction reinforcing the dramatic shift that had occurred in the room's dynamics. Harold's granddaughter, Jennifer, introduced herself with obvious admiration and thanked me for my courage in speaking up. "My grandmother would have loved you," she said with tears in her eyes. "She always said that dignity was something you had to fight for, not something that was just given to you." An older couple, probably in their late 60s, shared that they had experienced similar treatment from their own adult children, who had become embarrassed by their working-class backgrounds after achieving professional success. "It's more common than you might think," the woman said sadly. "Children who forget that their parents' struggles are the reason they don't have to struggle." Even some of the younger doctors approached me, seemingly genuinely moved by what they had witnessed. One young man, probably around Sarah's age, told me that my speech had made him think about his own mother, who had worked as a seamstress to put him through medical school. "I never thanked her properly," he admitted. "I think I need to call her tonight." But the person I most needed to hear from remained conspicuously silent at the head table. Sarah sat there, her celebration effectively over, her moment of triumph transformed into a lesson in humility that she clearly wasn't prepared for. The confident, accomplished woman who had been working the room earlier had been replaced by someone who looked lost and ashamed. David was speaking to her in low, urgent tones, but she wasn't responding, just staring at the table as if she could will herself to disappear. As the evening began to wind down and guests started to leave, I noticed something remarkable happening. People weren't just saying goodbye to Sarah anymore. They were making a point of stopping by my table to shake my hand, to tell me how impressed they were by my strength and grace, to share their own stories of family struggles and sacrifices. I had become, in the span of one speech, not just the most memorable person at this gathering, but the most respected. Harold leaned over to me as we watched the room slowly empty, the elegant crowd filing out into the crisp October night. "You know," he said with a smile that held decades of judicial wisdom, "in all my years on the bench, I've seen a lot of people fight for justice in courtrooms, but I've rarely seen someone fight for dignity as eloquently and effectively as you did tonight. That was a masterclass in moral authority." "Sometimes," I replied, watching as the last of the guests filtered out, offering their goodbyes and their newfound respect, "dignity is the only thing we have left to fight for. And sometimes, when you fight for it properly, you discover it was never really gone. It was just waiting for the right moment to shine." As the beautiful dining room that had seemed so intimidating when I arrived now felt like a place where I had reclaimed something important, not just my daughter's attention, but my own sense of worth and place in the world. The confrontation that would determine the future of our relationship was still to come, and I could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and necessary. The dining room had mostly emptied, with only a few stragglers finishing their conversations and gathering their belongings. The elegant space that had been filled with laughter and celebration now felt almost cathedral-like in its quiet dignity. The waitstaff moved efficiently through the room, clearing tables and dimming the chandeliers, but they gave our corner a respectful distance, sensing that something profoundly important was still unfolding between mother and daughter. The autumn flowers on the tables had begun to droop slightly, their vibrant colors muted in the softer lighting, but they still filled the air with a sweet, earthy scent that reminded me of the garden I had tended behind our house when Sarah was growing up. How many times had she helped me plant bulbs in that garden, her small hands dirty with soil, chattering about her dreams of becoming a doctor? When had she stopped seeing beauty in the simple things we had shared? Finally, Sarah stood up from the head table, her movements slow and hesitant. I watched as she said something to David, who nodded and squeezed her hand before stepping away to give us privacy. He looked genuinely shaken by what had transpired, and I wondered what conversations they would have later about the woman he was planning to marry and the values she had displayed tonight. Sarah walked across the room toward me, her steps uncertain and tentative, so different from the confident stride she'd displayed earlier in the evening when she was working the room like the accomplished professional she had become. Her beautiful black cocktail dress, which had made her look so sophisticated and successful earlier, now seemed to hang on her differently, as if the weight of shame had changed her very posture. When she reached my table, she stood there for a long moment, seeming to struggle with what to say. Her hands were trembling slightly, and I could see that she had been crying intermittently throughout the evening, her makeup smudged despite her attempts to repair it. Harold, with the wisdom and discretion of his years, quietly excused himself, gathering his coat and walking over to pat my shoulder gently as he prepared to leave. "It was an honor to meet you, Margaret," he said, with genuine warmth. "Don't let anyone ever make you feel invisible again. You're a force of nature, and the world needs more women like you." He glanced at Sarah, his expression kind but serious. "And young lady, you're very lucky to have a mother like this. I hope you remember that going forward." Sarah took the seat Harold had vacated, and for the first time all evening, we were truly alone together. Up close, I could see the full extent of her emotional turmoil. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her hands were shaking as she placed them on the white tablecloth, and there was a vulnerability in her expression that I hadn't seen since she was a child, coming to me for comfort after a nightmare. "Mom," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, so different from the confident tone she had used during her speech earlier. "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to begin to apologize for what I've done." "That's interesting," I replied, my voice still carrying some of the authority from my speech, though I could feel my own emotions beginning to surface now that we were alone. "Because you seemed to have plenty to say earlier tonight, to everyone except me. You thanked everyone who had supported you, everyone who had believed in you, everyone who had helped you get to this moment, everyone except the person who made it all possible." She flinched at my words as if I had physically struck her, but I wasn't going to make this easy for her. This conversation had been building for years, through all the times I'd been excluded from her life, diminished in importance, and taken for granted. Through all the family gatherings where I was treated like hired help rather than the matriarch, all the achievements she celebrated without acknowledging the foundation I had provided. "I never meant for the place card to say that," she said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush of panic and desperation. David's mother was handling the seating arrangements, and she must have misunderstood something. Or maybe there was a mix-up with the caterer, or— "Stop," I interrupted firmly, my voice cutting through her excuses like a blade. "Don't you dare blame David's mother for this. Don't you dare try to make this someone else's fault. Even if she wrote those words, you approved the seating chart. You knew exactly where I was being placed, and you were perfectly fine with it. In fact, I suspect you were relieved." Sarah's face crumpled at my words, and fresh tears began to fall, but I could see in her expression that she knew I was right. The truth was written all over her face. The guilt, the shame, the recognition that she had been caught in her cruelty and couldn't hide behind excuses anymore. "You're right," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're absolutely right, and I hate myself for it. I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed by your house with its old furniture and faded wallpaper, by your 10-year-old car with the dent in the side, by the way you dress in clothes from department stores instead of boutiques, by the fact that you're not like the other mothers here tonight with their designer clothes and their country club memberships and their husbands who are doctors and lawyers. The honesty of her admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I had suspected as much. Hearing it spoken aloud, hearing my own daughter articulate her shame about the life I had built for us, was more painful than I had anticipated. But I had asked for the truth, and now I was getting it in all its ugly, hurtful clarity. I wanted tonight to be perfect, she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of confession and self-recrimination. I wanted to fit in with these people, to prove that I belonged in their world of privilege and sophistication. I wanted them to see me as their equal, not as someone who had clawed her way up from nothing. And I thought having you in the background would be better than having you up front where everyone could see that I come from what, Sarah? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet, filled with all the hurt and disappointment I had been carrying for years. From a working-class family? From a mother who taught high school instead of practicing medicine? From a woman who shopped at Sears instead of Saks? From a life where we had to count every penny and make every sacrifice count? Yes, she sobbed, the word torn from her throat like a confession at a tribunal. And I hate myself for feeling that way, but I can't help it. I've worked so hard to get here, to earn my place among these people, and I was afraid that if they saw where I really came from, if they knew about the second-hand clothes and the food stamps and the nights when you worked 3 jobs just to keep us afloat, they wouldn't take me seriously. They wouldn't see me as their equal. I sat back in my chair, processing her words, feeling the full weight of how completely I had failed to teach her the most important lesson of all. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was okay, that I understood the pressure she felt. But the larger part of me, the part that had been hurt and diminished for too long, knew that this moment required complete honesty, no matter how painful. Sarah, I said finally, my voice heavy with disappointment and sorrow, do you know what I heard tonight when all those people applauded? I heard respect. Not for my clothes or my car or my house, but for what I've accomplished, for the sacrifices I've made, for the strength I've shown in building a life and raising children and surviving everything that tried to break me. Those people, your colleagues, your professors, your friends, they didn't see someone to be ashamed of. They saw someone to be admired. She looked up at me then, her eyes red and swollen, but finally, truly seeing me for perhaps the first time in years. You spent so much energy being embarrassed by me that you forgot something important, I continued, leaning forward to make sure she understood every word. I am not your weakness, Sarah. I am your strength. Everything you are, everything you've accomplished, everything you're capable of, it all comes from the foundation I built for you with my own hands, my own sacrifice, my own determination to give you a better life than I had. The silence that followed was profound, filled with years of misunderstanding and hurt that were finally being acknowledged. This was the moment that would determine whether we could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, or whether the damage was too deep to repair. What would you do in this situation? Could you forgive a child who had been ashamed of you? Or would some wounds be too deep to heal? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to see how this emotional confrontation resolves. Sarah and I sat in that quiet corner of the dining room for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. The country club staff continued their cleanup around us, but they moved with respectful discretion, understanding instinctively that something profound and important was being resolved at our small table. The crystal chandeliers had been dimmed to their lowest setting, casting long shadows across the room and creating an intimate atmosphere that felt almost sacred. The autumn flowers on the nearby tables had begun to release their evening fragrance more intensely, filling the air with the scent of chrysanthemums and marigolds that reminded me of the garden Sarah and I had tended together when she was young. Those had been simpler times, when her biggest worry was whether her science fair project would win first place, and when she still looked at me with unqualified admiration and love. "Mom," Sarah said finally, her voice stronger now, but still filled with emotion and regret, "I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I never stopped being grateful for everything you did for me, even when I was too proud or too stupid to show it. I got lost somewhere along the way. I got so focused on proving I belonged in this world of privilege and success that I forgot the most important thing, that you're the reason I'm here at all. I reached across the table and took her hand, feeling how cold her fingers were, how they trembled slightly in mine. Her hands were softer now than they had been when she was younger, when she used to help me with household chores and gardening. These were the hands of someone who had been protected from the kind of manual labor that had shaped my own life, and I realized that perhaps that protection had come at a cost I hadn't anticipated. "Sarah, I need you to understand something," I said gently, my anger beginning to soften into something more complex. Disappointment mixed with love, hurt, tempered by hope. "I'm not angry that you've succeeded. I'm not angry that you've moved into circles I never could have imagined when you were little, or that you've achieved things I only dreamed of. I'm proud of all of that, prouder than you can possibly imagine. What broke my heart was feeling like you thought you had to choose between your success and your mother, between your new life and the woman who made it possible." "I know," she whispered, tears starting fresh down her cheeks. "And I was wrong, so incredibly, devastatingly wrong. I thought I was protecting my career, my reputation, my future. But what I was really doing was betraying everything you taught me about loyalty, about gratitude, about remembering where you come from." "Do you remember?" I said gently, my voice taking on the storytelling tone I had used when she was a child. "When you were 8 years old and you fell off your bike in front of the Hendersons' house. You scraped your knee badly, and you were bleeding and crying. But you weren't crying because of the pain. You were crying because all the neighborhood kids were watching, and you were so embarrassed that they had seen you fall." She nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through her tears for the first time all evening. "I ran home as fast as I could, leaving my bike right there on the sidewalk. I was convinced that everyone would think I was clumsy and stupid." "That's right. And when you got home, I cleaned up your knee with hydrogen peroxide. Do you remember how much that stung? And I put a bandage on it with little cartoon characters. But then I told you something that I thought you had learned, something I hoped you would carry with you always. You told me that falling down doesn't make you weak," she said softly, the memory clearly coming back to her. "You said that staying down does. You said that the only way to prove to those kids that I wasn't clumsy was to get back on that bike and ride it right past their house with my head held high." "That's right. And do you remember what you did?" "I got back on the bike," she said, her voice growing stronger with the memory. "I rode it right past the Hendersons' house with my bandaged knee showing, and when Tommy Henderson called out to ask if I was okay, I told him I was fine, and that falling down was just part of learning to ride better." "That little girl who got back on the bike," I said, squeezing her hand. "She was never ashamed of where she came from. She was proud of how far she could go, but she never forgot the lessons that got her there. She understood that scars and bandages weren't things to hide. They were proof of courage, evidence of someone who was willing to take risks and get back up when life knocked her down." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing my words and the memory they had evoked. I could see her thinking, remembering not just that specific incident, but the broader lessons I had tried to teach her throughout her childhood about resilience, about dignity, about the importance of staying connected to your roots, even as you reached for the stars. "I want to be that little girl again, Mom," she said finally, her voice filled with determination and something that sounded like hope. "I want to be proud of where I came from, proud of you, proud of the life we built, together with our own hands and our own determination. I want to stop being ashamed of the fact that we didn't have much money and start being proud of how much we accomplished with what we had." "Then be her," I said simply, but with all the love and conviction I could muster. "It's never too late to remember who you really are, Sarah. It's never too late to come home to the values that made you strong in the first place." She stood up then and walked around the table to where I was sitting. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around me in a hug that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey through foreign territory. I could feel her tears on my shoulder, but they were different tears now. Not tears of shame or regret, but tears of relief and recognition. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered into my hair, her voice muffled but clear. "I'm so sorry for everything, for the place card, for hiding you away, for being ashamed of the most important person in my life, for forgetting that everything good about me came from you." "I know, sweetheart," I replied, holding her tight and feeling, for the first time in years, like I had my daughter back, "and I forgive you. But more importantly, I hope you can forgive yourself and learn from this." When we finally separated, I could see something different in her eyes, a clarity that had been missing for years, a return of the young woman who had once been proud of her hard-working mother and grateful for every sacrifice. "I want to make this right," she said, with determination. "Not just between us, but with everyone. I want people to know who my mother really is, what you've accomplished, what you mean to me." "You don't need to make grand gestures, Sarah," I said, though I was touched by her sincerity. "You just need to remember that I'm not someone to be hidden away or managed like an embarrassment. I'm someone to be celebrated, someone to be proud of, someone whose story is part of your story." As we gathered our things to leave the now empty dining room, Sarah turned to me with a question I hadn't expected. "Mom, would you consider moving closer to Boston? I know your house in Hartford means a lot to you, and I know it's where you and Dad built your life together, but I want you to be part of my life there. Really part of it, not just someone I visit occasionally out of obligation." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. "I'll think about it seriously. But if I do move, you need to understand that it won't be to hide in the background of your life or to be the convenient grandmother who babysits when you need help. It'll be to stand right beside you, exactly where I belong, as your mother and your friend." 6 months later, I did move to Boston. I found a lovely apartment in Cambridge, close enough to visit Sarah regularly, but far enough to maintain my independence and dignity. I joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at a literacy center for adult learners, and even began dating a retired professor I met at a poetry reading. Much to Sarah's delighted surprise and enthusiastic approval, Sarah kept her word about including me in her life in meaningful ways. When she got married the following year, I sat in the front row wearing a beautiful dress she helped me pick out, and I gave a speech at the reception that brought the house down and made everyone understand exactly where Sarah's strength and eloquence came from. When she started her surgical residency, she introduced me to her colleagues not as my mother, but as my mother, the woman who made all of this possible. But the most important change wasn't in how others saw me. It was in how I saw myself. That night at the country club, I remembered something I had forgotten during the years of being gradually marginalized and diminished. Margaret Thompson was never meant to be invisible. I was meant to be seen, heard, and respected, not despite my age or my background, but because of everything those years had taught me about strength, resilience, and the power of refusing to be diminished. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept being treated as less than you are. Sometimes the greatest victory is reminding the world, and yourself, exactly who you are and what you're worth. And sometimes the view from the back of the room is exactly what you need to see clearly enough to reclaim your rightful place at the front. The end.